Hello history lovers and welcome back. Queen Elizabeth of York was the first Tudor queen, despite descending from the House of York. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, defeated Elizabeth's uncle King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Prior to the battle, Henry had made an oath to marry Elizabeth. Henry was crowned King Henry VII and the two wed on the 18th of January 1486. Although a political move, Henry presented his marriage as an act of reconciliation between the two houses, and the iconic Tudor rose was born. In the late summer of 1486, Elizabeth was expecting the birth of her first child and heir to the throne. So, she moved to St. Swithin's Priory in Winchester. It was believed that Winchester had once been Camelot, and thus it seemed the perfect location for the birth of a prince who would once again unite his people. Henry VII also claims that the fictional King Arthur was an ancestor of his.
Right.
Either on late 19th or early hours of the 20th of September 1486, Queen Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Arthur Tudor. It is recorded that Elizabeth was in poor health after the birth of Arthur, but both mother and baby made a full recovery. He was christened on the 24th of September, and Elizabeth's family were heavily involved in the ceremony. Her mother, Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, was godmother, whilst her sisters, Cecily and Anne, carried the baby and the christen respectively. Her half-brother, the Marquess of Dorset, his wife, and John the Earl of Lincoln, carried the train of the christening robe. On the 24th of May 1487, Lambert Simnel was crowned King of England in Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin. Simnel was claiming to be Edward Earl of Warwick, the son of Elizabeth's uncle George Duke of Clarence. However, the Tudor family knew that Warwick was actually safe and sound in the Tower of London, and just to prove a point, they paraded the real Earl of Warwick to the public to dispel Simnel's claim. Simnel landed at Barrow-in-Furness with a small army and had joined up with the Earl of Lincoln, the same one that had been at the christening of Prince Arthur. Simnel and Henry's armies met at the Battle of Stoke on the 18th of June 1487. Simnel's army had formidable support and 2,000 mercenaries that were paid by Elizabeth's auntie, Margaret of Burgundy. The Earl of Lincoln was defeated and killed. Henry, who felt sorry for the clearly broke Simnel, employed him in the kitchens, and Edward Earl of Warwick remained in the Tower of London. Henry gave Simnel the kitchen job so he couldn't be accused of killing the supposed rightful king, as he could tell people his real name, and because it was too expensive to put people in prison, so might as well pay him to do a job. There was also a chance that Henry might have taken pity on a young man who was just clearly trying to earn some money. During this period of danger, Elizabeth and Arthur were at Kenilworth Castle, and with the first threat against their rule squashed, plans began for Elizabeth's coronation. 2 days prior to the coronation, Elizabeth came by barge from Greenwich to the Tower of London. The Queen was attended by her mother-in-law Margaret Beaufort, and one of the barges that transported her carried a fire-breathing red Welsh dragon. Upon arriving at the Tower, she was greeted by her husband, the King, and the next morning Elizabeth was dressed in robes of white cloth of gold, her long blonde hair loose and covered with a circlet of gold studded with gems, and she emerged from her room. Her sister Cecily of York was her train-bearer. Elizabeth was conveyed in a litter through streets hung with tapestry and other valuable cloth. En route there were child singers, and the streets were filled with spectators and well-wishers, as was the mall for the coronations of Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III. The procession was led by Henry's uncle Jasper, Duke of Bedford. Jasper Tudor was also married to Elizabeth's aunt Catherine Woodville. Members from both houses of York and Lancaster were present. This emphasises Henry's determination to bring the two houses together. Amongst Catherine's female attendants were Cecily of York, Catherine, Duchess of Bedford, Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, and the Countess of Oxford. Queen Elizabeth of York was crowned Queen of England on the 25th of November 1487, at Westminster Abbey. She was dressed in purple velvet and ermine, a sign of nobility, and waited under a canopy of state. Then she walked on a carpet that stretched to the entrance of the abbey. There she was crowned as queen, with her husband watching from a platform near the altar. After the ceremony, the queen returned to Westminster Hall for the coronation feast, which she presided over alone, with Henry again watching from a window. Shortly after the coronation, Parliament gave Elizabeth the status of femme sole, which meant that she could grant leases and sell land without her husband's permission, something that a married woman could not generally do. On the 28th of November 1489, Elizabeth welcomed her second child and first daughter, Margaret Tudor. This birth took place at Westminster, but due to an outbreak of measles in the palace, she quickly moved to the Palace of Greenwich. With a successful coronation and 2 children, Elizabeth probably felt a sense of security for her family and their place on the throne. Her husband had been king for about 6 years, but Margaret of Burgundy strikes again in 1491 with another pretender. This time, it's Perkin Warbeck. His claim was supported by James IV of Scotland and other English noblemen. Warbeck invaded England 3 times before he was captured in 1497. We will cover this in more detail, but just for now, put a pin in it. 28th of June 1491, Elizabeth gave birth to her 3rd surviving child and heir to the throne, Henry Tudor. In the July of 1492, Elizabeth gave birth to another girl whom she named Elizabeth. The summer of 1493 was a tense one. Although Elizabeth had survived worse, her husband, King Henry VII, was anticipating an invasion from Perkin Warbeck. To counteract Warbeck's claim, which, unlike Simnel, Henry didn't have concrete proof to dispel the lie, he invested his son as Henry, Duke of York, in November 1494. His eldest son, Arthur, was already Prince of Wales at this point. Early 1495, Elizabeth's paternal grandmother, Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, died, and Elizabeth got a big inheritance. In the July, Warbeck landed in Ireland. He was defeated in a skirmish at Waterford, but he escaped. Elizabeth and her husband were constantly together at this point in time, travelling their kingdom together. However, tragedy struck in the September as their 3-year-old daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, died. Queen Elizabeth was at Woodstock when she heard of the death of her daughter. The little girl was buried in a lavish ceremony fit for a princess in Westminster Abbey. Shortly afterwards, news came that Warbeck was now in Scotland. King James IV welcomed Warbeck and treated him royally. Like Henry VII, James's accession to the throne was not the most stable, and whereas his father prefers an alliance with the English, James was more inclined with a French alliance. Warbeck would allow James to keep Henry occupied at the border of England and Scotland. Warbeck was charismatic, which made him convincing as a prince. James took such a liking to Warbeck that he arranged a marriage with Lady Catherine Gordon, the daughter of the Earl of Huntly. However, Henry had now somewhat repaired relations with Burgundy. He had promised trade with Burgundy on the condition that Dowager Duchess Margaret stopped supporting Warbeck. James, on the other hand, was raising an army with the intent of putting Warbeck on the English throne. But Warbeck did not have a stomach for war, much to James's dislike. This was one of the most dangerous threats to Elizabeth and her children during her husband's reign. Elizabeth arranged marriages for her sisters Anne and Catherine in 1495, and a year later, on the 18th of March, Elizabeth gave birth to her youngest surviving child, Mary Tudor. Early June 1497, King Henry VII provided Elizabeth a strong escort from Sheen to Eltham to fetch her younger children. Prince Arthur was safe at Ludlow. Initially, they went to Lady Margaret Beaufort's home at Cold Harbour, but after receiving news that the rebels had arrived at Guildford on the 13th of June, she went to the Tower of London. Some of the leaders of the rebellion were executed, and some were granted a pardon. As soon as the rebels had surrendered, King Henry VII gave thanks at St. Paul's, and then went to the Tower of London to fetch his wife and children. And then the family returned to Sheen, also known as Richmond, Palace. Maybe it was him mellowing as he got older, but Henry preferred to seek peace than fight, and so he started negotiations with King James for a marriage between the King of Scots and his daughter, the Princess Margaret. James knew that with the failure of the rebellion, Warbeck's time was limited, so he gave Warbeck a few ships and pretty much washed his hands of him. Henry had managed to improve relations with the country supporting Warbeck, but Warbeck was still a problem. The rebels that were left welcomed Warbeck when he arrived at Whitsands Bay near Land's End in Cornwall on the 7th of September 1497. Warbeck was declared King Richard IV on Bodmin. However, when he clashed with Henry's forces again, he was forced to flee to sanctuary at Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire. Henry, seeking an end to all of this, promised a pardon to Warbeck. Warbeck confessed to being an impostor, and Henry hung very few of the rebels. Henry summoned Warbeck's wife, Lady Catherine, and forced her husband to once again confess the fact that he was an impostor in front of his wife. On the 5th of October 1497, Warbeck confessed to being an impostor in front of the king himself at Taunton Castle, and he was paraded through the city of London as an impostor. Lady Catherine was sent to Elizabeth, accompanied by suitable ladies, and Henry paid for her upkeep. Henry kept Warbeck at Sheen Palace, but did not allow him to sleep with his wife. He obviously didn't want any little pretenders running around. While this had been going on, Henry had also been in negotiations with Spain for a marriage between his son Prince Arthur and the youngest Infanta Catherine of Aragon since 1488, but the Spanish monarchs had been hesitant due to the business with Warbeck. With Warbeck dealt with, Queen Elizabeth of York wrote to Queen Isabella of Aragon and Castile in December 1497, asking to be kept informed of the health of her future daughter-in-law, whom we think of and esteem as our own daughter. She then wrote again requesting that the monarchs of Spain ensure that Catherine had good French, as neither Elizabeth nor her mother-in-law Margaret Beaufort spoke Latin or Spanish, and French was the diplomatic language of Europe at the time. They also suggested that Catherine accustom herself to drinking wine, as the water in England was not drinkable. In 1499, Perkin Warbeck and Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, plotted to escape the Tower of London. However, the plot was uncovered and Warbeck was hung, drawn, and presumably quartered, because they tend to do all three together or just the one on its own, on the 23rd of November 1499. Again, this mainly happened as Henry was being pressed by Isabella and Ferdinand, as they were worried about Catherine's safety in England, and killing Warbeck was Henry's way of reassuring them. The Earl of Warwick was beheaded on the 29th, although some sources say 28th, of November the same year at Tower Hill. It's uncertain if Elizabeth ever met Warbeck, but since he was at court for a time, it does seem likely, and if she did recognise him as her brother, she gave no sign of it. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, wed Catherine of Aragon on the 14th of November 1501 at St Paul's Cathedral. Elizabeth was dressed in white satin and purple velvet, and she travelled to the cathedral with her daughter-in-law. She and Henry then watched the ceremony behind a screen. Her daughter Margaret wed King James IV of Scotland by proxy on the 25th of January 1502. Elizabeth was attended by her sister Catherine and by Lady Catherine Warbeck, who was now going by Lady Catherine Huntley, which was her father's title. Margaret confirmed her willingness to marry, and to show her new rank as Queen of Scots, she took precedence over everyone except her parents, much to Prince Henry's annoyance. Elizabeth and Margaret shared a single mess dinner as queens, a mark of Margaret's new status. Elizabeth's cousin, Edmund de la Pole, and her brother-in-law, William Courtenay, were taken to the Tower for plotting a rebellion, and Elizabeth was at her sister's side, making her a part of her household and paying for the upkeep of her sister's children. Elizabeth would suffer devastation as her eldest son and heir, Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, died on the 2nd of April 1502. The King and Queen would receive the news 2 days later on the 4th of April. Henry VII was asleep at Richmond Palace. His friar woke him up, saying, "Your dearest son hath departed to God." Henry VII cried. Elizabeth comforted him and reminded him that he had 3 other children, and God is still where he was, and we are both young enough. Elizabeth returned to her rooms and wept. Henry heard of her grief and came to comfort her. Catherine of Aragon's future was unknown. She travelled to Richmond Palace. She was greeted by the Queen, whom she shared mutual sorrow, and whom would play a mother's part until such time as Catherine's future was decided. The court was plunged into deep mourning. Elizabeth and her daughters were dressed in deepest black. Arthur was buried in Worcester Abbey. With Arthur gone, Henry and Elizabeth tried again for another spare, as their son Henry was now the heir. Little did she know that this would be her final baby. The baby was a girl named Catherine, and she was born on the 2nd of February, 1503. Elizabeth, despite having successful births, would not be so lucky this time round, and suffered from childbed fever, and died on her birthday, the 11th of February, 1503. It is believed that the baby Catherine may have lived another week before joining her mother. News of Elizabeth's death was heavy and dolorous to the king, who privily departed to a solitary place to pass his sorrows, and would no man should resort to him. Elizabeth's death was a shattering personal loss for the king, which is evident in her grand public funeral. When Henry did finally abandon his chamber, it was an altogether colder and isolated man that emerged, one that began to treat his people with more harshness and severity than had been his custom. He never recovered. Elizabeth and her son Henry were close, and at only 11 he must have been heartbroken at the loss of an older brother and then a mother. Henry VII and his children were overcome with grief. Henry ordered a magnificent funeral and paid for 636 masses to be sung. The total cost of the funeral was nearly 5 times the amount spent on Prince Arthur's funeral. The Queen's sister Catherine was chief mourner, following the coffin as it made its solemn way through London. The streets were lined with mourners. Elizabeth had been popular, and her death caused great sorrow amongst her people. 37 virgins dressed in white held lighted tapers as her cortege passed through Fenchurch Street and Cheapside. It was not customary for kings to attend funerals, but Henry's stepfather, the Earl of Derby, and her half-brother, the Marquess of Dorset, were there, as the Earl of Essex and many other lords. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe, and let me know who your favourite Tudor queen is in the comment section down below. But until next time, have a wonderful day.